Following up from the last week's episode, I'm going to introduce you more disasters that modern Korea went through and related stories about them. If you missed the previous one, do check it out. The link's in the description and at the corner of the screen. Without further ado, let's delve into the tragic chapters in Korean history. As always, handpicked, translated and narrated by your host, Anthony. After the independence from Japan and 3 years under US military rule, the separate South Korean government was set up in 1948. The first president, Lee Seung-man, was once an independent activist, but surprise, surprise, turned out to be a dictator like so many other first leaders of a newly independent nation. He stayed in power for nearly 12 years until his political corruption and rigged election campaign triggered a mass uprising from all sections of the society, including young children.
Seoul, capital of Southern Korea. Riots on the scale of revolution. More was to follow, but it already looked like the end of the road for President Syngman Rhee. In earlier rioting, police killed 130 people, wounded close on 1,000.
So he resigned and fled to Hawaii. Unfortunately, what followed was a military coup and another dictator, again, as is the case with so many other countries. The new dictator, Park Chung-hee, a former army captain, ruled the nation with an iron fist for 16 years, until he was assassinated by his own man in October 1979. Now, the strongman gone, people were hoping and demanding for a more democratic nation in 1980, but a section of army generals once again opted for a coup. As the tension rose, the leaders of the coup quickly implied military rule to take the control. They imprisoned a prominent opposition leader, dissolved the parliament, and closed down universities which served as the epicenters of demonstrations. Their effort seems to pay off overall, except for in the southern province of Gwangju. Unlike most other part of the country, demonstrations didn't die down in Gwangju, and the leaders of coup d'etat reacted by sending military force. On May 18th, soldiers ruthlessly and violently crushed the civilians, regardless they were out on demonstration or not. It only triggered the panic and anger of the people. Facing the fierce resistance, the military sealed off the entire province, cut the telephone connection and other means of contact to the outside, and fired aimed shots at the civilians. It was not reported to the rest of the country what was really going on in Gwangju all the while. Situation now turned to that of life and death. Some people looted police stations to arm themselves to fight against the military. The last of the resistance barricaded themselves in the provincial government office until their eventual crush on 27th. At least 500 civilians were killed and thousands were wounded, but the true number is expected to be much larger than the official number. The leader of the coup, Chun Doo-hwan, became the president and the third dictator of the nation. During his 7-year reign, what happened in Gwangju in May 1980 was covered up. Even after that, Chun Doo-hwan denied he was responsible of the massacre until his death in 2021. Here I only stated a bare outline of the massacre, but there are so many grueling details in those 9 days in Gwangju, and the reality was more terrible than any stories can deliver. Needless to say, it still left as a huge scar in Gwangju that got even more raw because they were treated as Reds in the aftermath for a long time, and the whole thing accused as set up by North Korean spies. Now, I introduce you a couple of stories about Gwangju uprising and its scar. It's what my dad experienced when he was a high schooler. His family's from a small farming village, and he alone with his younger brother moved to a bigger town to attend the school there. It was politically dynamic time, and it wasn't uncommon high schoolers joining political gatherings and demonstrations. Being a hot-blooded teenager and living away from his parents, he was often a part of such scene. One day he got a telegram, well, that was the time, from his mom, my grandmother, that the situation was looking ominous in the country and he'd better come back home and stay low a while. As usual, Dad took it his mom being unnecessarily worrisome, but not long after, she indeed turned up to his lodging to take her sons home herself. But Dad, feeling himself a man already, insisted he'd stay put. In the end, his mom went back home only with her younger son. A few days passed without much issue, just joining a few sporadic demonstrations. Then, in his dream, appeared his mom, telling him, "Hide under the bridge." He didn't understand what that was supposed to mean. Meanwhile, overall atmosphere in the city was turning more and more intense and dark. Dad finally felt scared enough and finally decided to go back to his family home with his friend from the same village. They started their way in the late evening, walking over the field and along the foot of mountains, but soon they were stuck in the pitch dark. They decided to wait till the dawn break. Fortunately, they came across a bridge and sought a shelter underneath there to catch a snooze. And then Dad had yet another dream of his mother, telling him urgently, "Come back home now, quickly!" He woke up with a startle and saw a light from a truck. It looked like a military vehicle, and soldiers were taking people away on it. Fortunately, they didn't notice the boys under the bridge. As soon as the truck disappeared from his sight, he woke his friend up. He finally realized Mom's instructions in his dreams were not to be taken lightly. They walked through the night in the dark and could reach his home before the crack of dawn. And that day was when the soldiers opened fire to the civilians in Gwangju. The bridge they hid underneath was still within the city boundary, and had they stayed the night there, they would have been stuck in the siege of the town. My dad actually don't enjoy recounting the time. I could stitch up the entire story only bit by bit over the time, but each time Dad never failed to conclude his story with, "Your grandma saved my life." Apparently the whole time, Grandma prayed day and night for Dad's safe return home. I do think my grandma had something about her. She would still occasionally appear in dreams for other family members to inform them about something in their future. I love motorbikes. My work finishes invariably late in the evening, but being a passionate rider, I would take my motorbike out at night for a short ride. Today too, after coming back home at 10 at night, I took my bike out to take the route from Mudung Mountain to Hwasun. I'm pretty used to this particular way. It's usually empty at this time of the day and the air is fresh. I could really just ride along light-heartedly, enjoying the night view passing by. But tonight was a bit different. Probably because it was near the rainy season, the air felt humid and heavy. Even with a high beam on, I seemed to have a hard time to secure the field of view in the thick air. So, in slower than usual speed, I was just heading towards Noritze Tunnel. In the light from my headlamp, suddenly appeared a figure on the opposite lane. A soldier in his green uniform? For a second, I didn't believe what I really saw was what I saw. A lone soldier in the middle of nowhere? But next moment, I felt chills creeping up my spine like never before. I instinctively throttled up the speed to the full. My bike is pretty old and I usually avoid so much stress on it, but in that moment, all my instinct was telling me to get away from there as soon as possible. Once that moment passed, I realized why that chills felt so alarming. I did feel exactly the same overwhelming sensation before. When I was a teenager, my best friend who'd been suffering abusive parents chose to end his life. And that night when he killed himself, I was struck by the chills running down my spine out of blue. I panicked so much that I almost slipped the bike a few times. I had to make a stop at a convenience store to calm myself down a bit and came back home straight. Back home, it popped in my mind that I did read something about Noritze Tunnel in a news article sometime before. I searched on the internet and found... Apparently near the tunnel, it's suspected to be a mass grave of the victim of 1980 Gwangju uprising. Could the ghostly figure be something to do with that? But then, why in an army uniform? I don't know. But I think I won't go out for a night ride for a while. Moving into 1990s, Korea was booming and looking out for a hopeful future. The country finally got more democratic government, and its economy was growing in record-breaking speed. For the first time in decades, the ordinary people could think about the quality of life. But behind the gleaming facade were many neglected issues. Loose regulations, corruption up and down the rank, rampant result before substance attitude. And the decades-old holes in the society started appearing in the mid-90s in the form of various disasters. One of the first in the series of disasters was the train crash at Gupo Station in Busan. At 5:29 p.m. on March 28, 1993, a passenger train carrying 276 was approaching Gupo Station in speed of 85 km per hour. The driver saw a section of railway having collapsed about 900 meters to the station and triggered emergency brake. But it was too late. The puller, the generator, and 2 passenger wagons fell into the pit, and the rest of the following wagons derailed in impact. The first passenger wagon that was following the generator was literally crushed by the impact with a generator full of heavy machines, together with the passengers inside. Only 2 survived in this wagon. Overall, the accident left 78 people killed and 198 injured. The cause of the disaster, the collapsed railway, was accidentally created by the Samsung Construction under the Samsung Group umbrella, who was installing underground electric cable in the area. Without the permission or informing the authority, they used the blast method right next to the railway and caused a sinkhole. 16 people of the construction company were prosecuted, but eventually none of them was sentenced to a proper punishment. Samsung Construction was given relatively small fine and 6 months of business suspension. As with most other disasters in this period, the train crash at Gupo Station reveals the inadequacy of the society not only through the disaster itself, but also the lukewarm justice system. And now, here are some accounts about the Gupo Station train crash. I went to school in Busan and lived by myself there. I needed to earn my own pocket money, so I found a part-time job in Gupo Train Station. It was basically cleaning, tidying, and sometimes waking a drunken passenger fallen asleep on the bench after the last train of the day. One night, rain was pouring down. I was picking up garbages on the platform as usual and noticed about 100 meters further down the rail was something whitish flying in the air. There were quite a few signal posts and such about there, so I just assumed some random white fabric or plastic sheet must have been caught by one of them. But then I saw the white thing every rainy night. Nobody told me anything about it, but it started bugging me. Wouldn't that be blocking the view of the signal or something? I talked about it to a fellow part-timer, and he said he would go and get it down, no problem. And from the following day, he didn't show up to work. It was time before mobile phones, and I thought he was not well perhaps, but he never came back. Other railway staff simply said he had quitted. Another rainy night, and I was back on my duty picking up garbages. And again, there was that white thing flying in the wind. But didn't my colleague said he'd take it down? Somehow I felt uneasy. But curiosity was still bigger, and I decided to check it out myself. As I got closer, step by step, I felt each creeping up. The white thing looked more and more like a person. I wanted to deny it, but it was unmistakably a person in a white dress. A woman with a bob-cut hair. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, the woman whispered, "It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. It hurts." Time after time. I turned around and ran, away from her and her whisper. Fortunately, the voice got smaller as I got closer to the platform, or so I thought. "It hurts!" A scream rang right in my ears, and at the same time something tugged my foot, falling me down to the ground. "I'm gonna die," was the last thing I thought before I passed out. When I woke up, I was lying alone in the staff's room. I fumbled around and found my head was loosely wrapped with a bandage. I wanted to get up, but my body didn't move. I just rolled my eyes around and saw somebody standing at the door. A woman in a white dress. Her one arm and half of her face were crushed and mashed up. And she came up to me and started strangling me. I thought I was sure to die this time. But just before I passed out second time, a railway staff came in with a couple of medics, and with that, the woman disappeared. The staff explained that he found me collapsed near the platform and was bleeding from my head. As soon as the medic finished dressing my wound, I couldn't stop myself. I ran out to the platform. Rain was still falling, but there was that white thing, or the woman, no more. I quitted the job. I'm pretty sure my colleagues saw the same thing too, and stopped coming to work. Ever since the train crash, there has been rumors of ghost sightings and weird phenomena around Gupo Station and the residential area nearby, some of which go like this. Along the railway are rows of old houses. One night, a passerby saw a woman walking along those houses in rain, even without an umbrella. He wondered who could that be, and gave a glance as he walked past her. The woman was carrying a baby without a face, and the woman herself was missing an arm. Or another rainy night, a man was crossing the train track. He saw a woman in a long skirt just standing on the opposite side, motionless. He thought it odd and gave a quick look, and her face hidden under the umbrella was half crushed. Another story among the residents of the houses along the track is, occasionally past 10 at night, they would feel the familiar rumble of train approaching. Nothing unusual living by the train track. Problem is, the expected train would never pass by. Or other residents would say they would look out of the window hearing the sound of a train passing by, only to find nothing. Less than 7 months after the train crash in Busan, a passenger ferry sank off the southwestern coast on October 10th. And this disaster was once again a textbook case of negligence in every level. The Westsea Ferry was at the time the only passenger ferry linking Wido Island to the mainland. The demand grew for the past decade as the island became popular among hobby anglers, but the plea for the more service had been ignored by the authority. That day was Sunday, and the ferry was carrying 362 passengers, 141 over the designed capacity. The sea was rough too, with 2 to 4 meter high waves, and it was against the regulation to run a passenger ferry in that condition. But the ferry being the only service of the day, it went ahead regardless. The boat was woefully understaffed. The navigator was absent and his job was taken over by the bosun. Without the navigator's control, about 16 tons worth of produce from the island was loaded not evenly through the cargo space, but stacked at the forward for the ease of unloading. There were only 2 safety crews for 362 passengers. To make the bad situation absolutely worse, the right side propeller was seriously hampered by tangled up fishing nets and ropes. So, a boat, loaded too much, unbalanced and understaffed, went off sailing in the high waves. And it capsized, no wonder. It obviously happened so quickly and completely that the captain failed to make a distress call before the equipment went off under the water, and most passengers had no chance to put on the life vest or escape the boat. Indeed, most bodies were found still trapped in the ferry. The official rescue crews took an hour to arrive, and the handful of survivors were rescued by fishing boats nearby. The authority promised for proper investigation, compensation, and future investments, but none of that came true. While the media made sensational reports that the captain and the other crews survived and ran away based on feeble witness account, until their bodies were found in the boat later. The disaster resulted in 292 lives lost. Now, here's a particularly spooky story about the Westsea Ferry disaster. For a time, I was mad about going fishing in the sea. In the olden days, when the marine life was rich around coast, one could just draw the fishing rod from the breakwater and could still score a beautiful sea bream. But now anglers have to go further and further out to the sea. Current fashion is to take a boat to a rocky reef or small unmanned island to fish there. With the fishing industry in decline, some captains with small boats would make it a firm side business to commute anglers out to such spots. It's actually a very dangerous activity. Some reefs have a steep cliff 10-12 meters straight to the sea, while others could go completely underwater at high tide. In such a case, anglers are literally betting their life on the punctuality of the captain. And yet, some hardcore anglers would go out to such a reef or island with a tent and just fish on for days, all alone in the middle of the sea, apart from his captain bringing the regular supplies. This is of course illegal due to its obvious risk, but it's still an open secret between anglers and captains because, after all, police can't possibly patrol around all the reefs and islands dotted around. Anyway, one October day, I went out to Wido for fishing. I made a stop at the local fishing shop, basically the assembly point of anglers and captains, and heard somebody moaning at the back room of the shop. I asked the shop owner about it, at which his face turned dark instantly. He simply said it was Mr. Kim. I knew him too. A man in his 50s, he was notorious as a hardcore angler who would live out in the sea for weeks on end. We did drink together on a couple of occasions too. I stopped by the back room to see what happened to him. He wasn't himself, with his eyes sunk deep in the shadow. I first thought he must have been drinking too much, which was obvious judging by the smell of alcohol filled in the room. But why was he shivering and moaning then? I didn't get any response from him, so I asked the shop owner again. Apparently Mr. Kim had been in that state for a week. He came by 2 weeks ago to stay put in one of his favorite islands to fish. But then, when his captain stopped by a week later to hand over the regular supplies, Mr. Kim wasn't himself already. He jumped on the boat, leaving all his beloved fishing rods, equipment, and tent behind. And since then, he wouldn't come out of the room, just emptying bottles all day long. Anyway, just so happened, the police raided the port that day, and the captain who was to bring me out to the sea was caught for some violation. After some drama and scenes of arguments about refunds and ruined day, only I and another middle-aged angler were left in the shop. I had no reason to hurry back home anyway, so suggested to have a drink together instead. And when we opened the bottle, Mr. Kim sneaked in, joining us. He seemed a bit more lucid now, and I could finally hear what he experienced on the island. The island he went to was a golden spot, and indeed he fished up quite a few big ones. But the weather turned for worse into the evening, so he wrapped it up and withdrew into his tent. It was still early in the evening and the moon hadn't even risen yet. And in that dusk, he heard weird noises below the cliff. He wondered if it might be some porpoise and looked down the cliff and saw several people walking southwards across the sea. The island was sitting good 10-meter deep water already, and there was no way people could casually walk over the water. But there they were. Soon there were more of them, many, many more of them. Some 100 people were walking against the grey low sky and agitated sea. Some were marching on, some were staggering, others were looking back as if not wanting to go. Men, women, a couple in hand, even some kids following their parents. Mr. Kim was of course deeply shocked, but thought he was just hallucinating. After all, older generations used to say not to look at the night sea too long, otherwise one might see something one is not supposed to see. He gave himself a slap and cleared his throat loudly to snap himself out. But at that noise, the people on the sea turned to look at his direction, and then started climbing up the cliff. There was no way to run away on that isolated island. Mr. Kim ran into his tent and just closed his eyes and covered his ears. Nevertheless, he couldn't block the sound of numerous hands rubbing across the tent and telling him,
Come with us. Come with us. Come with us. Come on. Join us. Come with us. Join us.
All he could do was shivering and pleading to save him before he eventually passed out. When he got up, it was already morning. He thought to pack up, but his body wouldn't move. He just emptied all the soju he brought with, waiting for the boat to come back. But even back on the shore, he heard those voices calling for him. Come on, come with us. And so he had to drown it with more soju thus far. When Mr. Kim finished his long monologue, I and the other angler didn't know what to respond, until the fishing shop owner broke the silence with a dark face.
The day you saw the ghost of the sea, wasn't it October 10th? You know what happened that day a few years ago? It's the day the Westsea Ferry sank.
Yes, the accident that killed 292, many of which were hobby anglers. Hi, it's Anthony here, and thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Reading through various stories about disasters, basically an event beyond the victim's control, I sense one thing in common. The desire wanting to deny our life could just be cut short and end by a sheer chance or a bad luck. Whether it be a story about foreboding, saving a life from the disaster, or resentful soul still lingering around, the base idea is the matter of life and death couldn't be just by a chance and couldn't be without a consequence. I usually don't argue for or against a paranormal belief, but I must admit, reading about disasters that killed so many innocent lives in an instant, I too cannot but wish that there was something more, some meaning and context to these senseless deaths. By the way, if you are more interested in the uprising and massacre in Gwangju, I recommend you to check out the 2017 film A Taxi Driver. It should provide you with more of a context and human drama that I couldn't possibly fit in this episode. And there are more disasters than I could fit in this one episode, so I'd have to continue it into next episode. So stay tuned. If you enjoyed my work, please leave it a comment and a like, and please consider subscribing to my channel. If you'd support me more directly, I also have a Buy Me a Coffee account. The link's in the description. Buy Me a Coffee supporters will get an access to my new videos a week ahead of others. Thank you. I'll come back next week with more disasters. Stay safe and take care.